Welcome back, Focus Learners. Today, we're diving into an absolutely epic historical journey. In this explainer, we're going to look at the ancient Indian education system. It was this massive, holistic framework that literally shaped global knowledge. And we're going to explore how it was systematically dismantled. And then, how its core ideas are actually being revived today through the National Education Policy 2020. It's a fascinating story, so let's get right into it.
So here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll start with the ancient Gurukul system, look at how India became a global hub of knowledge, trace the exporting of that wisdom to the world, objectively review the fall of ancient education, examine the flaws of our modern system, and finally, look at reviving Indian knowledge systems today.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the ancient Gurukul system, and its focus on holistic learning.
You know, when we talk about the Indian Knowledge System, or IKS for short, we're not just talking about basic reading and writing. Not at all. This was a vast repository of indigenous wisdom, uniquely designed to build character, emotional intelligence, and real societal harmony. It seamlessly integrated hard sciences like astronomy and mathematics, right alongside philosophy, arts, and spirituality. The goal wasn't just to make a student employable, right? It was genuinely designed for the complete realization of human potential.
And way before we had these modern graduation ceremonies with the caps and gowns, this ancient system had some highly institutionalized rites of passage to mark a student's disciplined journey. First up was Vidyarambha, where a child would trace their very first alphabets in a plate of rice. Then came the Upanayana. This initiated them into the Brahmacharya phase, which was a period of intense self-discipline, focus, and celibacy dedicated entirely to learning. And finally, after a dozen or more years of rigorous study, the Samavartana ceremony marked their official graduation.
Moving right along to Section 2, Global Hubs of Knowledge and Centers of Excellence.
To really wrap our heads around this, just think about the sheer scale of ancient Indian universities like Nalanda. Picture a campus back in the 5th to 12th century CE, literally housing 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers. This massive operation was funded entirely by royal grants and community philanthropy, meaning students were totally freed from the burden of having to earn a livelihood while they studied. It was a true global hub, drawing top-tier scholars from China, Korea, Tibet, and Central Asia.
So how did they manage all that? Well, they used some pretty brilliant teaching methods that merged rigorous critical thinking with character building. Instead of written exams, students were assessed continuously through intense debates. They practiced advanced memory training techniques, which modern science actually shows improves cognitive function, by the way. They even used educational games. For example, Mokshapatha, which is actually the ancestor to the game Snakes and Ladders, was used to teach moral virtues and strategy.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 3. Exporting this wisdom to the world.
If you look at the historical timeline, it's actually wild to see the extraordinary flow of this knowledge. We see foundational concepts of Ayurveda and mathematics originating in India, then migrating east to China through dedicated scholars. Then it travels west to the Arab world, where Indian medical texts were translated at Baghdad's famous House of Wisdom. Eventually, these texts made their way all the way to Europe through translation schools in Spain, effectively acting as a major catalyst for the European Renaissance.
To put the sheer scale of this into perspective, let's just look at one guy, the Chinese scholar Xuanzang. He braved incredibly dangerous trade routes just to study at Nalanda. When he returned to China, he brought back 657 Indian texts. The Chinese emperor was so impressed, he provided Xuanzang with a massive staff, and they spent the next 20 years translating all this wealth of knowledge. Globally, massive hubs like the Alexandria Library went to extreme lengths to acquire and copy these highly sought-after manuscripts.
Now, we need to take an objective look at Section 4, the fall of ancient education and its historical disruptions.
Historical records from the era document a period of severe devastation wrought by Islamic invaders. Chroniclers at the time, like Minhaj-e-Siraj, objectively detailed the destruction of these grand universities like Nalanda and Vikramshila. Scholars were killed, massive libraries were burned to the ground. This horrific violence forced the surviving educators to scatter to the peripheries of the subcontinent, and it effectively crippled those institutional networks of higher learning.
Later on, as the sources show, British colonial policies explicitly set out to dismantle whatever indigenous systems were left. You can see it right there in Thomas Babington Macaulay's famous 1835 Minute. The goal was to strictly impose an English-centric curriculum. The objective was no longer holistic human development. Instead, it was the mass production of administrative subjects to serve the British Empire, actively suppressing native languages and sciences in the process.
But here's something really fascinating. Despite all that destruction at the university level, local village education was remarkably resilient. Archival research by historian Dharmpal reveals that in the 1830s, almost every single Indian village still had a functioning school, known as a pathshala. What's more, these schools were highly inclusive, with Shudra students often forming the majority. Sadly, crushing colonial taxation eventually starved these rural communities of their resources, causing this grassroots network to just collapse into poverty.
Fast forward to today, which brings us to Section 5, Flaws of the Modern System, and examining that disconnect.
When you compare the two side by side, it's pretty eye-opening. We basically traded that lifelong, deeply personal mentorship for a really formal transactional teaching model. We traded a holistic curriculum for one that is incredibly fragmented and hyper-focused purely on career outcomes. And perhaps most importantly, we replaced continuous, debate-based evaluation with high-stakes, standardized, exam-driven testing.
And the consequences? Well, they are profound. Today, a staggering 68% of urban students experience heavy exam-related anxiety. By stripping away the emotional, moral, and spiritual anchoring that the ancient systems provided, we've essentially created an environment of immense pressure, leaving students without the inner resilience they need to actually navigate it.
So what do we do about it? That's Section 6, Reviving Indian Knowledge Systems and the Path Forward. The National Education Policy 2020, the NEP, aims to fix this and revitalize these systems. But the hard data reveals a massive implementation gap. Right now, only 12% of teacher training programs actually incorporate the Indian knowledge system. And look, you can't teach what you don't know, right? So training our educators is absolutely the critical bottleneck here.
It's a similar story with the curriculum itself. Less than 5% of school curricula explicitly reflect this indigenous knowledge right now. The vast majority of our educational framework remains strictly tied to mainstream Western models. So this tells us that while the policy intentions of the NEP 2020 are incredibly promising, we need rapid ground-level action to make it a reality for these students.
But as current academic research shows, scholars and policymakers are actively working on this. The NEP 2020 isn't about, just blindly going backwards. It's about bridging the absolute best of the Gurukul traditions, like learner-centered, multidisciplinary approaches with global, modern scientific wisdom.
To actually bridge this gap, we need highly specific practical steps. Things like integrating Vedic math and ancient astronomy right into modern syllabi. We can mandate IKS training for all new teachers and actively revive that deep mentorship bond. By leveraging community support through corporate social responsibility funds, kind of like the philanthropy of ancient times, we can build an inclusive, culturally rooted, yet completely globally competitive system.
I want to leave you with this final thought for this explainer. As we navigate an increasingly complex, fragmented, and frankly stressful world, how can looking back to the holistic, character-building wisdom of our ancient past be the very key to unlocking the future of global education? Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me today. Stay curious, focused learners.